You're tuned in to Channel 19 Mysteries, and I am your host, Midnight Rider. Picture this. You are driving down a seemingly endless stretch of two-lane blacktop. The glowing neon of the city is hours behind you, and the encroaching darkness presses against your windows like a physical weight. Your cell phone reads, "No service." It's just you, the hum of your tires, and the pitch black void of the open road. Then, your engine stutters. A cloud of thick smoke erupts from the hood, and your car coasts to a dead stop in the middle of nowhere. The silence that follows is deafening. Out here in the isolated wastelands, a breakdown isn't just an inconvenience, it's a dinner bell. Because out in the dark, there are things hunting for the stranded. But sometimes, if you're lucky, salvation comes from the most impossible places. Tonight, we are traveling deep into the sun-scorched, unforgiving expanse of the Mojave Desert to uncover the chilling legend of a phantom savior, a sinister predator, and a haunting truth that will make you pray your engine never fails in the dark. Before we pull off onto this dark highway, do me a favor. If you enjoy exploring the strange and the unexplained with me, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment down below letting me know, what is your greatest fear when driving alone at night? Your support keeps the headlights on here in the studio and helps us broadcast these mysteries to the world. Buckle up, lock your doors, and turn the volume up. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The Midnight Mechanic, a desert legend. If you are drawn to the unexplained and the chillingly real phenomena that hide in the dark corners of the world, then you have come to the right place. Tonight's story takes us away from the dense, claustrophobic forests and the deep, murky waters and places us directly into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Amjiman Southwest. Specifically, the deeply isolated, sun-scorched stretches of the Mojave Desert. To understand the sheer terror of what it means to be stranded in the Mojave, you first have to understand the geography. When you drive out of the neon glow of Las Vegas, or leave the sprawling concrete limits of Southern California, civilization drops away with alarming speed. Within 20 minutes of highway driving, the gas stations disappear. The cell phone towers become sparse and then vanish entirely. You are left with a two-lane ribbon of cracked black asphalt cutting through a seemingly infinite ocean of sagebrush, jagged rock formations, and undulating sand dunes. During the day, the temperature regularly surges past 115 degrees. The heat radiating off the pavement creates shimmering mirages that distort the horizon. If your vehicle breaks down out here under the midday sun, and you do not have adequate water, your life expectancy is measured not in days, but in hours. But the desert at night is a completely different kind of monster. When the sun sets, the temperature can plummet by 50 degrees or more. The darkness is absolute, a suffocating, pitch black void, completely devoid of ambient light. It is in this environment where the line between life and death is razor thin that the legend of the Midnight Mechanic was born. But before this benevolent entity began haunting the desolate highways, these lonely stretches of road were hunting grounds. Our story truly begins with a man named Scott Baker. For 22 years, Scott was a patrolman for the California Highway Patrol, stationed out of Barstow. Scott was a seasoned, hardened officer who had seen every type of tragedy the road could offer: horrific collisions, exhausted drivers falling asleep at the wheel, and the devastating results of driving under the influence. But the cases that haunted Scott, the ones that kept him awake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, were the Vanishings. Between the early 1970s and the mid-1980s, the stretch of Interstate 15 and the smaller arterial roads branching off it, such as Kelbaker Road and Sema Road, earned a grim reputation among local law enforcement. Cars would be found pulled over on the shoulder, their engines completely dead, their hoods sometimes popped open in a universal distress signal. But the occupants of these vehicles would be completely gone. The standard theory was always that the drivers, desperate for help, had abandoned their vehicles and attempted to hike through the desert toward a distant light or a perceived town, only to succumb to the elements. But Scott knew the details of these scenes intimately, and they never quite added up to simple exposure. In many cases, bottles of water were left sitting on the passenger seats. Wallets and purses were left in the glove compartments. There were rarely any footprints leading out into the deep sand. The case that embedded itself into Scott's soul occurred on October 17, 1981. It was a Tuesday morning. Scott was on routine patrol on a desolate stretch of State Route 127 when he spotted a powder blue 1978 Plymouth Volare parked haphazardly in the dirt off the shoulder. The driver's side door was hanging wide open. Scott pulled his cruiser up behind the vehicle, activating his flashing lights. As he approached the Plymouth, his hand instinctively rested on his sidearm. The silence of the desert was deafening. He looked inside the car. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat sat a half-eaten sandwich in a plastic wrapper and a thermos of coffee that was still lukewarm. A woman's purse was tucked onto the floorboard. Checking the registration, Scott learned the car belonged to a 24-year-old school teacher named Clara Higgins. Scott called in a massive search and rescue operation. For 6 days, helicopters scoured the desert grid. Tracking dogs were brought in, but they simply circled the car in a state of confusion, unable to pick up a scent leading into the wasteland. Clara Higgins was never found. But what disturbed Scott the most was the mechanical state of the Plymouth. When the tow truck arrived to take the vehicle to the impound lot, the mechanic on the scene gave Scott a puzzled look. The car's alternator belt had been cleanly snapped, but there were strange, greasy handprints all over the engine block handprints that were far too massive to belong to the petite Clara Higgins. It was as if someone else had been under the hood, someone who had stopped to help. Scott Baker, along with many other veteran officers, harbored a dark, unspoken theory. A predator was operating in the Mojave. Not an animal, but a human monster who cruised the lonely highways in the dead of night, waiting for the inevitable mechanical failure of a passing traveler. This predator wasn't hunting for sport in the wilderness. He was letting the unforgiving environment do the trapping. When a car broke down, the predator would pull up, offering salvation to the desperate, terrified occupants, only to make them disappear forever. For years, this phantom predator stalked the Mojave. But then, right around 1989, the disappearances abruptly stopped. People still broke down, of course. The desert is merciless on engines, but the people were no longer vanishing. Instead, strange, almost unbelievable reports began to filter into the highway patrol stations and local diners. Reports of a guardian. By the year 2003, Scott Baker had retired from the highway patrol, but he could not let go of the desert's mysteries. He started a late-night AM radio show broadcasted out of a small, cramped studio in Victorville, California. The show was called The Midnight Frequencies. It aired from midnight to 4 in the morning, catering to long-haul truckers, insomniacs, and those who worked the graveyard shift. Scott used his platform to discuss true crime, local legends, and unsolved cases. And it was through this radio show that Scott first began to piece together the existence of the Midnight Mechanic. The first major breakthrough came during a broadcast on the night of September 9th, 2006. The studio's switchboard lit up, and Scott put a caller on the air. The man's name was Brian Davis. His voice was trembling, thick with residual trauma from an event that had occurred 8 years prior, but which he had never reported to the authorities for fear of sounding insane. Brian's story took place on July 14th, 1998. He, his wife Diane, and their 7-year-old son Tommy were driving back to San Diego after a family vacation to the Grand Canyon. They were driving a dark green 1989 Ford Taurus because Brian wanted to avoid the heavy daytime traffic and the blistering heat. He had decided to make the drive through the Mojave at night. It was a fatal miscalculation. At approximately 2 in the morning, while traveling down a totally unlit, desolate stretch of the Mojave National Preserve, the Ford Taurus began to shudder violently. Brian watched in horror as the temperature gauge on the dashboard violently pegged into the red zone. A horrific, metallic, grinding noise erupted from the engine block, followed by an explosive hiss as thick, white Sweet-smelling steam billowed out from under the hood, instantly blinding the windshield. Brian fought the steering wheel, managing to muscle the heavy, dying vehicle onto the gravel shoulder. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died completely. The sudden absence of the engine noise made the silence of the desert outside feel heavy, almost crushing. Panic immediately set in. Brian tried his cell phone. As expected, the screen read, "No service." He got out of the car, coughing as the steam dissipated into the freezing night air. He popped the hood. The radiator had completely ruptured, and a massive crack was visible in the engine block itself. Coolant was bleeding out onto the dry desert dirt. The car was not just broken down, it was dead, irreparably destroyed. Diane and little Tommy sat in the back seat, wrapped in thin blankets, shivering as the desert temperature rapidly dropped into the low 40s. They had exactly 2 plastic bottles of water and half a bag of pretzels. They were roughly 40 miles from the nearest town in either direction. Brian knew the grim reality. If no one drove past them by sunrise, the desert would become a convection oven, and they would be in a fight for their lives. For 3 agonizing hours, the Davis family sat in the pitch-black car. Not a single pair of headlights appeared on the horizon. The psychological toll was devastating. Brian later told Scott on the radio that he had begun to hallucinate in the darkness, imagining shapes moving out in the sagebrush, imagining the legendary predators of the desert circling his family. Then, at precisely 5:15 in the morning, just as the sky was beginning to turn the faintest shade of bruised purple, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness in their rearview mirror. Brian scrambled out of the car, wildly waving his arms, screaming for the vehicle to stop. The headlights slowed, pulling up onto the gravel directly behind the dying Ford Taurus. As the vehicle idled, Brian could see that it was an incredibly old, rusted, heavily modified tow truck. It looked like a 1972 Chevrolet C10, painted a faded, chipped mustard yellow. The engine of the tow truck had a distinct, deep, rhythmic rumble, and the air immediately filled with the sharp, acrid scent of ozone and burning grease. The driver's side door of the tow truck creaked open. A massive, towering figure stepped out onto the gravel. Brian stood frozen, his initial relief suddenly replaced by a spike of raw, primal fear. The man was easily 6'4", wearing heavily stained, dark blue coveralls. A battered baseball cap was pulled down low over his eyes, and a thick, grimy rag was wrapped around his lower face, obscuring his features entirely in the shadows. Brian immediately began babbling, pleading with the man. "Please, our radiator exploded. My wife and kid are in the car. We just need a ride to the next town. I'll pay you whatever you want." The massive man did not say a single word. He did not even look at Brian. He simply walked with slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps past Brian and directly to the front of the smoking Ford Taurus. The man reached out with bare, massive hands and grabbed the searing hot metal of the hood, pushing it all the way open. Brian flinched, knowing the metal should have instantly blistered the man's skin, but the stranger did not even react. What Brian witnessed next defied all laws of mechanics, physics, and reality. The stranger reached into the deep pockets of his coveralls and produced a large, heavy steel wrench and a roll of black tape. Moving with blinding, impossible speed, the man's hands became a blur over the engine block. He didn't ask for a flashlight. He seemed to see perfectly in the pitch black. Brian watched, paralyzed by confusion, as the man reached directly into the cracked, ruined radiator. There was a sickening sound of metal being wrenched and twisted. The man then walked back to his tow truck, retrieved a dented, archaic metal jug, and walked back to the Taurus. He poured a thick, dark liquid from the jug directly into the shattered engine components. The entire process took less than 4 minutes. When he was done, the massive stranger took a dirty rag from his pocket, slowly wiped his massive, grease-stained hands, and then slammed the hood of the Taurus shut with a deafening bang. For the first time, the man turned his head and looked directly at Brian. From beneath the brim of the baseball cap, Brian saw eyes that caught the faint morning starlight, eyes that looked incredibly sad, incredibly tired, and almost hollow. The man raised one massive, grease-stained finger and simply pointed directly at the driver's seat of the Taurus. Trembling, terrified, Brian slowly backed away and got into the driver's seat. He looked at Diane, who was clutching Tommy, her eyes wide with fear. Brian put the key into the ignition. He knew it was impossible. He had seen the crack block. He had seen the guts of the engine bleeding out on the sand. But he turned the key anyway. The 1989 Ford Taurus roared to life instantly. It didn't sputter. It didn't knock. It purred with a smooth, flawless hum that it hadn't possessed since it rolled off the assembly line a decade prior. The temperature gauge immediately snapped directly to the center, perfectly normal. The heater blasted warm air into the cabin. Brian gasped, tears welling in his eyes. He grabbed his wallet, intending to give the man every dollar he had, which was nearly $300 in cash. He threw open his door and stepped back out onto the gravel, but the shoulder of the highway was completely empty. There was no faded yellow tow truck, no taillights were fading into the distance. The vast, flat expanse of the desert stretched out for miles in every direction, and there was absolutely nowhere a massive truck could have hidden or turned off. The stranger had vanished into thin air. When Brian Davis finished telling the story on Scott Baker's radio show, the phone lines went completely dead for a full 10 seconds. Then, the switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree. That night opened the floodgates. Over the next several years, Scott Baker collected dozens of nearly identical stories from callers all across the Amjaman Southwest. The details were always astonishingly consistent. The breakdowns always occurred in the most dangerous, isolated stretches of road, far from any help. The victims were always people who were highly vulnerable, families with young children, elderly couples, or solo female travelers. And the savior was always the same. The callers described the massive, silent man in the stained blue coveralls. They described the rusted 1972 Chevrolet tow truck. They described the smell of ozone and burning coffee. And most importantly, they described impossible mechanical resurrections. Engines that had thrown rods, transmissions that had shattered into jagged shrapnel, electrical systems that had completely melted down, all fixed in a matter of minutes in pitch darkness by a man using nothing more than bare hands and antique hand tools. But perhaps the most compelling account came from a man who was the exact opposite of a vulnerable traveler. His name was Jim Stevens. Jim Stevens was a veteran long-haul trucker, standing 6'2" and weighing 280 pounds, covered in faded military tattoos. He had been driving 18-wheelers cross-country for 25 years. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or ghost stories. But on the night of November 2nd, 2004, Jim Stevens encountered the Midnight Mechanic. Jim was hauling a massive load of refrigerated perishable goods down a terrifyingly lonely stretch of US. Route 50 in Nevada, often dubbed the loneliest road in Amjima. It was shortly after midnight, and a freak early season blizzard had descended upon the high desert. The snow was blowing horizontally, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. Suddenly, the massive diesel engine of his Peterbilt rig violently seized. The truck shuddered, the air brakes locked up, and the massive vehicle skidded to a halt, completely blocking the snow-covered highway. The cab instantly plunged into darkness as all electrical power failed. Jim Stevens was a seasoned mechanic in his own right. He grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight and stepped out into the howling blizzard. He popped the massive hood of the rig. What he saw made his blood run cold. The main serpentine belt had snapped, whipping around the engine compartment and violently severing several vital fuel lines. Diesel fuel was spraying everywhere, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero temperatures. Jim climbed back into the freezing cab and grabbed his CB radio, desperate to hail another trucker. He keyed the microphone. Breaker 19, this is Big Jim. I got a dead rig blocking both lanes on Route 50, near mile marker 86. I need immediate assistance. Over. He released the mic and listened. There was nothing but the heavy, rhythmic hiss of static. He tried again and again. For 40 minutes, Jim Stevens sat in the freezing darkness as the temperature inside the cab dropped below freezing. He knew that if he fell asleep, he would never wake up. Then, the static on the CB radio suddenly cut out, replaced by a sharp, piercing whine that made Jim wince. A voice came through the speaker. It didn't sound like it was being broadcast over radio waves. It sounded like the voice was inside the cab with him. It was deep, grating, and sounded like two pieces of rusty iron grinding together. The voice said 5 words: "Hold tight, on the way." 10 minutes later, through the blinding, swirling curtain of snow, a pair of dim, yellowish headlights appeared. Jim watched as the rusted 1972 Chevy tow truck slowly backed up to the front of his 18-wheeler. Jim grabbed a heavy tire iron from behind his seat, not knowing who was out there, and stepped out into the storm. Through the driving snow, he saw the massive figure in the blue coveralls. The man was already standing on the front bumper of the Peterbilt, leaning deep into the massive engine compartment. Jim approached, yelling over the howling wind, "Hey, buddy, the fuel lines are shredded. You can't fix that without parts." The mechanic ignored him. Jim stepped closer, shining his heavy mag light directly onto the man's hands. What Jim Stevens saw in that beam of light burned itself into his memory forever. The man's hands were bare, exposed to the sub-zero blizzard, but they didn't look like human hands. The skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, pulled tight over heavy bones. But what terrified Jim was the grease. The hands were coated in thick, black engine grease, but the grease seemed to be moving. It was shifting, swirling over the man's knuckles like a living liquid. The mechanic reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of black tape. He didn't replace the shredded fuel lines. Instead, he simply wrapped his massive hands around the severed rubber, squeezing tightly. Jim watched in absolute horror and awe as a faint, bluish light seemed to emit from the mechanic's palms. The torn rubber of the fuel lines literally fused back together, molding into a perfect, seamless tube. The mechanic then reached down, grabbed the 2 ends of the snap serpentine belt, and squeezed them together. The thick, reinforced rubber melted and bonded instantly. The man stepped down from the bumper. He looked at Jim Stevens. The snow was falling heavily, but strangely, not a single snowflake landed on the mechanic's clothes. It was as if a foot-wide force field of invisible heat surrounded him. The mechanic pointed his grease-stained finger at the cab of the truck. Jim, a hardened, fearless trucker, felt his knees go weak. He stumbled back to the cab, climbed in, and turned the key. The massive diesel engine roared to life with terrifying power. All the electrical systems instantly rebooted. Jim looked out the window to thank the man. But the highway was empty. The tow truck was gone. And most terrifying of all, there were absolutely no tire tracks in the fresh snow leading to or away from the front of Jim's rig. With dozens of corroborating stories like these meticulously logged in his studio, Scott Baker became obsessed. He transformed a wall of his radio studio into a massive map of the Am Gym in Southwest. He began placing red pins at the exact coordinates of every reported breakdown and subsequent rescue by the Midnight Mechanic. When Scott stepped back and analyzed the map, a profound realization washed over him. He grabbed a blue marker and began circling the areas where the horrific, unsolved vanishings of the 1970s and 80s had occurred, the hunting grounds of the presumed serial predator, including the spot where Clara Higgins had vanished. The red pins of the Midnight Mechanic perfectly overlaid the blue circles of the vanishings. The mechanic wasn't just appearing randomly. He was specifically patrolling the deadliest stretches of highway. He was actively intercepting vulnerable travelers in the exact locations where the predator used to hunt. Scott Baker realized that the Midnight Mechanic was not just fixing cars. He was saving lives. He was standing between innocent people and whatever dark, monstrous force used to stalk those desert roads. But who was he? Why was he doing this? Scott spent the next 3 years digging into local archives, death certificates, and old newspaper microfilms from every small town bordering the Mojave Desert. He was looking for a very specific profile: a massively built mechanic driving a 1972 Chevy C10 tow truck who had died tragically in the desert prior to 1989. In March of 2010, Scott found him. The article was buried on page 4 of the Barstow Desert Dispatch, dated September 5th, 1974. The headline read, "Local Mechanic Succumbs to Elements on Kelbaker Road." The story detailed the tragic death of a 34-year-old man named Ezekiel Cross. Ezekiel owned a small, struggling garage called Cross & Sons Auto on the outskirts of Barstow. He was known in the community as a gentle giant, a man who would regularly fix the cars of poor families for free, often working late into the night. According to the article, on the night of September 3rd, 1974, Ezekiel was driving home to his wife Martha, who was 8 months pregnant with their first child. Ezekiel was driving his prized possession, a freshly painted, bright yellow 1972 Chevrolet C10 tow truck. Tragically, irony struck the master mechanic. While driving down the brutally desolate Kelbaker Road, the engine of his tow truck suffered a catastrophic, unfixable failure. It was a Tuesday night. The road was deserted, but Ezekiel knew his wife was waiting for him. Desperate, he decided to do the one thing you must never do in the desert. He left his vehicle and attempted to walk the 26 miles back to town in the pitch dark. The coroner's report, which Scott eventually obtained, painted a horrific picture. Sometime during the night, the temperature plummeted. A freak sandstorm rolled through the valley, drastically reducing visibility and dropping the temperature to near freezing. Ezekiel, dressed only in his oil-stained blue coveralls, became hopelessly disoriented. But what broke Scott's heart was the detail found in the police log. The authorities determined that during Ezekiel's desperate march, at least 6 different vehicles had driven past him on the highway. Because he was a massive man, covered in grease, stumbling out of the darkness in the middle of the night, every single driver had been too terrified to pull over. They had all locked their doors, accelerated, and left him behind in the dark. Ezekiel Cross was found dead of exposure 2 days later, curled against a rock formation 3 miles from his truck. His hands were stained black with grease, his fingers worn to the bone from where he had apparently tried in his final delirious hours to dismantle a piece of an old, rusted wire fence, hallucinating that he was trying to fix an engine. He died because his car broke down, and no one stopped to help him. Scott stared at the newspaper clipping. The tragedy was profound. Ezekiel Cross had experienced the ultimate terror of being abandoned in the desert. And when he died, rather than passing on, it seemed his spirit had tethered itself to the asphalt. When the Vanishings began, when a predator began using the desert to hunt people whose cars had failed, just like Ezekiel's had, the gentle giant had returned. Ezekiel Cross became the midnight mechanic, ensuring that no one else would ever suffer the terror of being stranded in the dark, and protecting them from the human monsters that roamed the highways. Scott Baker had his answer, but as a former highway patrolman and an investigative journalist, simply knowing the truth wasn't enough. He needed absolute proof. He needed to look the ghost in the eye. Scott meticulously planned what he knew would be the most dangerous night of his life. He targeted the exact date, August 22nd, 2012. It was a night of a new moon, meaning the desert would be plunged into absolute crushing blackness. Scott loaded his battered 1997 Jeep Cherokee with high-tech audio recording equipment, a heavy-duty CB radio, and 3 days' worth of water. He did not bring a cell phone, knowing they were useless out there anyway. And crucially, he did not bring a weapon. If he encountered the mechanic, he wanted no aggression. If he encountered the predator that the mechanic fought against, well, Scott accepted the risk. At 11 at night, Scott drove out onto the most remote, treacherous section of Kelbaker Road, exactly 3 miles from where Ezekiel Cross's body had been discovered 38 years prior. He pulled the Jeep onto the gravel shoulder and turned off the headlights. Then, Scott Baker deliberately sabotaged his own vehicle. He took a pair of heavy bolt cutters and violently severed the main battery cables. He took a heavy hammer and smashed the alternator until the casing cracked. He crawled under the Jeep and unscrewed the oil pan drain plug, letting the dark, slick oil bleed out completely into the desert sand. He destroyed his engine so thoroughly that no mortal mechanic could fix it without a tow and thousands of dollars in parts. Scott climbed back into the driver's seat, rolled down the window, and waited. The isolation of the Mojave Desert at midnight is a physical weight. The silence is so absolute that it creates a high-pitched ringing in your ears. The darkness is so total that you cannot see your own hand held an inch from your face. For the first 3 hours, Nothing happened. The temperature dropped steadily. Scott sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, his heart pounding a steady, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He began to doubt himself. Had he gone insane? Had he spent years chasing ghost stories fabricated by sleep-deprived drivers? Then, at 3:40 in the morning, the atmosphere in the desert changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a drop in barometric pressure, so sudden and violent that Scott's ears popped. The ambient temperature, which had been hovering around 50 degrees, instantly plummeted to freezing. The windows of the Jeep rapidly frosted over with a thin layer of crystalline ice. The heavy, metallic stench of burning oil, rust, and old coffee flooded into the cabin through the open window, so thick Scott could taste it on his tongue. Scott slowly turned his head to look in the rearview mirror. Two faint, dim yellow orbs were glowing in the darkness. They were approaching slowly, silently, hovering a few feet off the ground. As they drew closer, the dim glow illuminated the rusted, battered grille of a 1972 Chevrolet C10 tow truck. The truck didn't make a sound. There was no grinding of gravel, no hum of an engine. It simply glided out of the darkness and stopped directly behind Scott's ruined Jeep. The driver's side door of the tow truck opened. The massive silhouette stepped out. Scott was a former cop who had been in shootouts. He had faced down armed suspects. But as the towering figure of Ezekiel Cross walked slowly toward his window, Scott found that he was completely paralyzed. His vocal cords refused to work. His breathing became shallow gasps. The mechanic stopped right outside Scott's window. The man was so close that Scott could see the intricate, stained stitching on the faded blue coveralls. The battered baseball cap shadowed the face completely. The hands resting at the man's sides were massive, terrifying, and coated in that shifting, unnatural black grease. Scott forced himself to speak. He had to. He pushed through the suffocating aura of supernatural dread. "Ezekiel," Scott whispered. His voice cracked, barely audible. "Ezekiel Cross." The towering figure stopped moving. The massive, grease-stained hands slowly curled into fists. Very, very slowly. The man lowered his head and peered directly into the open window of the Jeep. Underneath the brim of the hat, Scott saw the face. It was the face of a man who had been dead for 4 decades. The skin was the color of old parchment, pulled tight over the skull. But the eyes were not human. They were deep, empty voids that contained swirling pools of faint, starlight-like luminescence. Looking into those eyes, Scott felt an overwhelming wave of crushing sorrow. An eternity of lonely nights spent walking the asphalt, searching for a home he could never reach. The mechanic did not speak, but the temperature in the car dropped another 10 degrees. The frost on the windshield thickened. Then, the mechanic stood up straight. He walked past the window to the front of the Jeep. He grabbed the hood and forced it open. Scott watched in awe as the ghost of Ezekiel Cross performed his impossible work. The man reached directly into the ruined, smashed alternator. Scott could hear the terrifying sound of metal bending, scraping, and reforming under the phantom's bare hands. The mechanic took his ancient metal jug and poured the dark, viscous liquid directly into the open oil reservoir. He grabbed the severed battery cables, holding one in each massive fist, and slammed them together. A shower of brilliant, blue-white sparks illuminated the desert night, casting long, monstrous shadows across the sand. Ezekiel slammed the hood shut. He walked back to Scott's window. He raised one massive, terrifying hand and rested it gently on the doorframe of the Jeep. The metal instantly turned to ice beneath his touch. Ezekiel leaned in close. The smell of ozone was overpowering. And then, for the first and only time in recorded history, the midnight mechanic spoke. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep, dry well. It was a voice composed of grinding gears, rushing wind, and endless exhaustion. He looked Scott directly in the eyes and whispered, "Start the car, Scott. They are coming." Scott didn't hesitate. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The destroyed, oil-drained, violently sabotaged engine of the Jeep Cherokee roared to life with terrifying, flawless power. Scott looked back to the window, but Ezekiel was gone. the yellow tow truck was gone. But Scott realized something else. He looked into his rearview mirror, staring deep down the pitch-black highway. Far in the distance, maybe 2 miles back, a pair of headlights had just crested the horizon. But they weren't the dim, yellow lights of an old tow truck. They were the bright, blinding halogen high beams of a modern vehicle. The vehicle was driving erratically, speeding up, slowing down, weaving slightly as if the driver was scanning the shoulders of the road, searching for prey. Scott realized that the predator, the force responsible for the vanishings of the 70s and 80s, was still out there, and it found him sitting in a broken down car in the middle of nowhere. If Ezekiel Cross had not appeared and magically resurrected the Jeep, Scott Baker would have been sitting in the dark, helpless, when those high beams finally pulled up behind him. Scott slammed the Jeep into drive and floored the accelerator, tearing away from the shoulder, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. He drove the remaining 90 miles to Barstow without taking his foot off the gas, staring in the rearview mirror the entire way, watching the distant, predatory headlights eventually fade into the darkness, unable to catch him. Scott Baker returned to his studio the next day. He never went back out into the desert at night again. He continued his radio show, The Midnight Frequencies, until he passed away peacefully in his sleep in November of 2021. But the legend did not die with Scott. To this day, if you find yourself driving down a desolate stretch of the Mojave Desert in the dead of night, and you hear the terrifying sound of your engine failing, do not panic. Do not leave your car. Lock your doors, sit in the darkness, and wait. Because out there, in the lonely, starlit expanse, Ezekiel Cross is still on patrol. Bound to the highway by a tragedy he could not escape, the ghost in the grease continues his eternal shift. He wanders the black asphalt, listening for the sound of failing engines, fighting a silent, endless war against the true monsters of the desert. The midnight mechanic ensures that the road home remains open, and that no one else ever has to die alone in the dark. What a chilling reminder of just how isolated those desert highways can truly be. It makes you wonder who or what is really driving out there in the dark with us. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and thank you for tuning in to Channel 19 Mysteries. If Ezekiel's story sent a shiver down your spine tonight, please help support the channel by hitting that like button and subscribing. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a broadcast. I also want to hear from you down in the comments. What would you do if your engine died on a pitch black stretch of the Mojave at 3 a.m? The road is long and it is full of secrets. If you have any stories of your own, whether they are creepy encounters, unexplained sightings, or a brush with the unknown, I want to share them. Send your experiences to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and you might just hear your story featured in an upcoming video. Until next time, keep your headlights bright, check your rearview mirror, and please stay safe out there.